like, it's just, again, it's not the cartoon superhero that he's giving us. He's going like, here are the relevant facts of this person's life, and they're always mixed. Like, it's never more than 7/10 good, you know. So yeah, you do, even like as a 45-year-old, you read Plutarch, or probably especially as a 45-year-old, you read Plutarch and you go like, I mean, this was just some guy, basically. Like, it really was like, he's hardly more virtuous than me,
Mhm.
and like, he was just in the place at the time.
For the inaugural episode of my podcast, I had my friend Casey of the Godward podcast on to discuss Plutarch and what you get, quote unquote, from reading his lives. Casey is an ex professor of English literature who now podcasts on classical and overall just good books. I highly recommend his channel for anyone interested in truly thought provoking analysis of good books. Okay, so we're here today to talk about Plutarch. So, Professor Casey, how when did you first learn
Right.
about
So
Plutarch
that's your question.
and who he was?
Yeah, not in school, which I think is an interesting thing to mention. Not in school, not even in college. I mean, I may have heard of him. He does have like the kind of name that you may have heard of, but for me, yeah, it was reading. I want to say Michel de Montaigne, probably, which I just picked up at a bookstore one time. Maybe Herman Melville, maybe Emerson. Like, any of these writers would have read Plutarch and referred to him occasionally. So somewhere along the line, I heard his name. I remember I picked up a copy of, I think it was like a 2-volume set of the, I think it was Greek, and like, I don't even, it was, some 1960 edition or something. And I sort of read them when I was like 24, 25 years old, but I had no idea what I was reading. And like, I had maybe only read Tacitus at the time, as far as like histories in that period. So it was really kind of beyond me. And this is, I mean, maybe this is one of those things we can talk about if you're interested in talking about like introducing it to, young people. Because there is like a barrier to entry, I think, which is just that there's all these old Roman and Greek names. And, it's like, it's not the easiest thing to just pick up and start reading. So that was the first time I read Plutarch. And then I guess years later, as I got older, I became more interested in the classics. And I don't know, I picked him up probably after, like, Tacitus and Suetonius and Thucydides, and somewhere in there, Plutarch rose to the top. What
Interesting.
about you? Like, when did you first look at Plutarch?
I first found out about him when I was like looking into homeschooling my kids. So I don't know, probably 5 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because there's like a whole community of people that have their kids basically reading Plutarch when they're, I think, 10 in the fifth grade. And they'll read like like the mom will read out loud to the kids. Not just like any Plutarch either. They actually read like the North translation, which is like the one
Oh,
that
like
Shakespeare,
1559.
yeah, the
Yeah.
one that Shakespeare would have been reading. Because,
Wow.
like, it was so, like, fundamental to, um like, specific translation was, like, the most influential. It's the one that people, like, it's probably the one that Herman Melville would have been reading, I guess.
Right. Or maybe, I think Dryden did a translation in the
Oh,
late
yeah, I think you're
17th
right.
century,
I've
but
heard
still, maybe. Yeah.
worse things about that one. I don't know. I haven't read it, but
I think this question of like the barrier to entry thing is really interesting. I can almost imagine, like, if you just read like a page a day or something with 10-year-olds, and you were prepared, like if you had read it the night before, so you were prepared to kind of explain any of the names, or like, there's a lot of geography kind of things in there. You could maybe talk them through it, but I don't know. It is, to me, like, that question of doing it in the North translation, like, what do you think? I don't know. I mean, I guess if you're also reading King James, and
Mhm.
Shakespeare when you're 10.
Mhm.
Like, I just don't know. I've never met a 10-year-old who's doing that stuff. So,
Yeah, I
but I guess it's
mean,
possible. I mean,
yeah, there's people that say, it works, and it's you're right, it's the same people who are reading the King James only the King James version of the Bible to their kids when they're, little. So I guess if
mhm.
you grow up, like, hearing that kind of language, maybe it wouldn't be so difficult. But I don't know
It's
because
kind of
I'm
two
so
things at once. Like it's like to acquaint yourself with that, like King James era language is one thing, and then to also learn all of the kind of relevant history that goes along with Plutarch. It's kind of a lot to do, but I mean, 10-year-olds can do a lot too if you push them. It's just like my own experience was so different from that. I was reading like, just chump stuff like the autobiography of Jackie Robinson or something in fourth grade.
right.
So it's, like, so I wasn't, it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I was really reading kind of grown up stuff, I guess.
Mhm. Okay, well, I think everyone for people who are listening to this, their burning question is probably why should we read Plutarch? Or, what
Yeah.
are we gonna get out of this? Like, why is this important?
Yeah. I mean, I won't read to you, but like the first paragraph of the Life of Alexander, kind of he
You can
explains
read.
this. It's
You
like,
can read to me, that's fine.
he says in the first paragraph of the thing on Alexander, the Life of Alexander, he says, "I'm not writing history but biography, and the most outstanding exploits do always have the property of revealing the goodness or badness of the agent. Often, in fact, a causal action, the odd phrase, or a jest reveals character better than battles involving the loss of thousands upon thousands of lives, and so on." So, like, the idea is that, I mean, with somebody like Alexander the Great, of course, you could like do what Diodorus Siculus does in his Life of Alexander and explain like the history of it. But that's not really what Plutarch gives us, and it's not really his main objective, I think. So, like, what you're really getting is it's biographies. It's like people. It's like souls he's trying to present, or minds. Like, who was this guy? And I guess since what I did have open, let me read you while we're reading one little extra thing from the life of Simon. This is like about 2 pages in, and he says, I think this is really interesting about like his own philosophy of biography, I guess, which seems like it's a thing. He says, when painters are faced with a slight blemish of some kind on the beautiful and pleasing figures they portray, we do not expect them either to omit it altogether, which would stop their portraits being true likenesses, or to stress it, which would make them ugly to look at. By the same token, since it is difficult or more probably impossible to represent a man's life as entirely free from shortcomings and blemishes, we should supply the truth, confident in its verisimilitude when dealing with the good aspects of our subject's life. However, the flaws and defects which, prompted by emotion or by political necessity, taint his actions, we should regard as lapses from a virtue rather than as manifestations of vice. We should not then be particularly eager to overemphasize these flaws in our account, but should write instead as if we felt ashamed of the fact that human nature fails to produce any character which is absolutely good or unequivocally virtuous. So, like, what I think part of the reason I like Plutarch so much, and it does, by the way, it really does seem to be like a thought that's probably stretching the minds of a 10-year-old, but like, this is the kind of thing sometimes where you don't recognize what you learned at age 10 until you're older, so it's possible. But that, like, people are like a mixed bag usually. So like, and I think that takes a little bit of it's like that's a sophisticated leap for a 10-year-old. Like, my son's 4, but he's really into superheroes and that kind of crap, where it's like, I guess that's fine for a kid, but you don't want adults to be dividing the world into like good guys and bad guys, because frankly, like, even the good guys aren't, you know good, like, just with a capital G without flaw. So I think part of what like Plutarch always presents is full three-dimensional people. And you kind of like so so like one of the things I say in one of my videos about Plutarch is that ultimately you're learning more about Plutarch than the characters that he's telling you about, because like ultimately you're learning to see people the way that he sees them, and he sees them just like with such insight and care, that's what's good about Plutarch, I think. He was like a middle Platonist, and he was a philosopher, and he was a like priest of the cult of Isis. So he's a guy who clearly was like hyper educated and had a sense of divine or sacred to the extent that I guess like pre-Christians could have it. And I think that but like at the same time, like it's interesting to me. I was thinking about the Alexander one. You said we might talk about the Alexander life. Have you read that one, by the way?
Yeah.
Did you did you pick up on how there's all these references to how drunk Alexander likes to get, for example? He was quite a drinker.
Yeah.
And it's like it's the kind of thing, like I don't know, like what do we do with that? With like a 10-year-old, you're trying to kind of it's hard for me to imagine explaining, like I don't know, it just because like for a grown up, that's just part of who he was. Like, he conquered Asia and he drank too much. And that's interesting. You know, I don't because I'm not judging him, but like I think for a 10-year-old, that's a harder. I don't know. Maybe you could just like maybe they would learn that that's real life faster.
Hmm. I also think it's interesting, like you're you're not supposed to sort of like explain it to the kids. Like you're supposed to just read it and then they take their own interpretation. Um,
Yeah. Well, there are like I think I would think the curriculum would be okay with explaining like what verisimilitude means, right? To
right. Yes. But not
Yeah,
saying, oh, okay, like this is what Alexander did and this is why he was the good guy or something like that, you know?
right. I don't think you would have to do that. And I think like there are moments in many of the lives that are uh well, actually they remind me of Old Testament stuff where you kind of are like, geez, is that God? Like that's kind of bad in some cases. We're talking about like, I don't know, genocide or other sort of taboo things, but there they are. And probably the same sort of thing. Like what do you say about it? Maybe nothing. Maybe you just read the story of Moses and Aaron or whatever.
Mhm. Um, yeah, it's interesting what you said about, Alexander being or any of Plutarch's biographies being about like sort of three-dimensional characters. But I think another like part of the idea of like why Plutarch is or like I think what you get out of reading it is like you see that history is driven by real people and they're not just like
Yeah.
these yeah, like kind of like you said, like these superhero cartoon characters.
Hmm.
And I think that especially for younger people helps them see that like they are a part of history or like,
Yeah.
history is driven forward by actual people and the decisions that they make and it's not just this thing that happens kind of, like, outside of you?
Yeah, totally. The life of I think it's Nicias comes to mind where he like he's just like he's a guy of like advanced, I can't remember, learning, and he's an athlete and all this stuff, and he has like the best intentions, but it keeps going wrong. And Plutarch's like smart and sophisticated enough to see that the problems that he ended up like in some cases seemingly creating still weren't really like his fault. It's more like it just all happened. Like this guy was there for it. And, so like even though his life kind of looks like a disaster, it's an instructive disaster to see that a lot of what we think of as greatness is just like luck, frankly.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I was reading one of the other ones that I really liked was the life of Cato the Elder. Because Cato's kind of um like a curmudgeon-y conservative sort of stick in the mud, I guess. And and he ends up like in this position of the censor, which is kind of like, I mean, we don't really have, I don't know, maybe it's like, I don't know what it's like. It's like, the people who run the rating system, the MPAA rating system or something like that. But it was more like personal. He'd go around and, shame people. And, but I remember there's a scene in there where it talks about him cracking down on usury, like on money lenders and stuff. And it's not clear. Like, first of all, it wasn't a very popular, um, like policy, and it's not clear that it worked very well. But it's interesting to see that he felt like it was the right thing to do, and like even though it was unpopular, he did it, and it kind of didn't work. But it was just an interesting mess, I guess. And sometimes Plutarch can present that in like, I don't know, fun and interesting ways that make you, kind of like you end up like identifying with the main character, but it's like sometimes it kind of stings, or it feels like, oof, that wasn't the best.
Yeah.
Which like is, I mean, the older you get, the more like that inevitably happens to a person,
Hmm.
like your best efforts kind of come up short.
Right.
And then you're like, but that's also Cato the Elder. Like that's pretty good company, you
Yeah.
know?
um, okay, so why can't we just read a summary of Plutarch? Why do we have to read from the
Yeah.
horse's mouth?
The horse's mouth makes me think of, there was a scene in the Alexander life where, do you know Alexander's horse's name? This is good trivia.
Bucephalus. Yeah.
Oh, good. That's nice. I feel like
That's
that's one
that's
of the
my
things that should
favorite.
be like,
That is my favorite scene, like, by far.
yeah, that should be like, I feel like that's a password, or like, you know what I mean? That's like an insider knowledge thing for like homeschooled kids or something.
Absolutely, yeah.
The Yeah, but,
Mhm.
why not read a summary? I mean, yeah, I think like I'm kinda like, this is one of my lifelong interests because it's not, I don't, and by the way, I don't claim to have it figured out. Like, I've thought about it a lot, but the idea of, um, ushering young children through the levels that are necessary to become like fully literate, if that's ever even a thing, like, because I think most people have a, and this is true, this is certainly true of like public school instructors, they have those like standards and benchmarks that might say like you're reading at a 10th grade level or something. But basically the way that it works is they teach kids to read, and then they're like, well, they can read, like that's it.
Yeah.
But that's not it. It takes years. I mean, I think years. Like when I think of it, I think I was tweeting last week something about how I think if I were to guess at it in retrospect, I would say probably like 10 years of reading for about an hour a day would turn you into like a pretty much fully competent reader. And that's a lot. Like most Americans don't come close to that by the time they're like, let's say 20, you know?
Mhm.
Which is why college students, like most college students can't read uh like grown up things, it's just inaccessible to them. So I think like part of why we read dark is because it's like it's challenging in that way. It is s- sort of like you'll realize that reading, you don't like well, like I have a daughter in 7th grade who has read a bunch of those like young adult books. These are books that are like made for 10 or 12 year olds, and they're easy because there aren't references to obscure things or places or things that you would have to like pause and look up, you know?
Mhm.
But I think that like if you do get children in the habit of doing that from an early age, like, and just say like we don't have to go fast. We like maybe it's 5th grade. Let's spend this year reading Plutarch's Life of Alexander. It's like 70 or 80 pages,
Mhm.
and but like and so that means like we only do 2 pages a week, but we're gonna really do those 2 pages. So I mean, and this is like, obviously, I don't know, like I only homeschooled my kids 1 year. It seems like it would be kind of a lot of work, but like, the volume I'm using is this Oxford thing,
Mhm.
and it has pretty good notes. like for most of the obscure references. So I would think if the parent read it the night before, you could fake it, first of all, but also like if you really read it like the month before, you could do some of the like isn't that like this must be part of the secret of Plutarch. I think this is part of it is that like good homeschooling mothers are interested in education, and so like they like it too, ideally.
Hmm.
So if you see something you don't understand, you would be inclined to look it up so that when you're teaching it, you can share that with the kid. Like, right?
Yeah. I think it's interesting too because most of the moms that are reading this with their kids, I'd say probably 99% of them, haven't read this before. Like
Hmm.
they did not have this type of education growing up, but they want to give it to their kids. Yeah.
So it's like trying to do better for your kids than you received yourself, and I think that's like admirable. And I th- I think like you were saying, like you don't have to be prepared to be a professor of Plutarch. Like it'll accumulate, and I think I don't know. I mean, I looked at the is it the Charlotte Mason one has Plutarch in almost every grade after fourth grade, right?
Yep. Mhm.
So I
I
think
think
like
they read yeah, they would read, like, 3 lives per year, or, like, if it was a longer one, maybe 2,
mhm. Yeah.
but
So I think like if you're fine with the idea that like in fourth, fifth, sixth grade, you're kind of it's almost like you're just a it's like the first time you listen to a classical symphony, you're just listening, like you're just passively you're not like judging anything, you're just kind of like this, and so you have to listen to it 10 times before it means anything to you. It's probably the same way with reading Plutarch. I mean, I think it accumulates so that you're like it's like putting a puzzle together. You're filling in pieces on a timeline, on geography maps, Rome, Greece, like the the world from 500 BC through Plutarch's period. And like so you don't have to know everything at once. Like it's okay to just kind of not understand certain things. I mean, this is actually like a really interesting topic in general to think about the classics and how you start to like I don't know, like almost have the courage or the confidence to keep like butting your head up against this mysterious stuff. You know, I don't know any other. I don't know any like programmatic way to do that other than to just keep looking at it until it starts to come into focus. You know,
mhm.
like I did that with I think first with like kind of early American literature. So it was easier to read, like you can read like a Poe story or Hawthorne or something, and it's a little weird, but like your brain will kind of translate for you because it's relatively familiar. And I did it with like Russian literature, where again, all of a sudden you're disoriented by the names, and there's like each character has three names, and Moscow and St. Petersburg, and what is all this stuff, and it's all disorienting. But like you just kind of keep going, and eventually your brain will kind of piece it together, and then pretty soon you're able to like so like now if I read one of the lives that I haven't read, I already have in my mind the layout of kind of the classical world, and I can just go like, oh, this one fits here. And that's pretty fun. Like that's pretty cool once you start to see, I don't know, like, oh, like when you read the life of Caesar, and then you read Tacitus describing Caesar, or Suetonius describing Caesar, or whatever, Livy, and then, or I don't know if Livy, and then Shakespeare, or whatever. Like you have, then it really does start to get kind of three dimensional. But that's like, it's not going to happen in fifth grade. So don't feel like you failed, if your fifth grader isn't an encyclopedia at the end of the year.
Right, and Plutarch, he wasn't writing about his contemporaries, right? He was writing about people that lived 500 years before him, or how.
Yeah, mostly. I'm trying to think. Well, he did write about Caesar, who like so Plutarch was born in what, like 48 AD. So up to like almost his lifetime, you know. It would be like writing, I don't know. It's interesting to think about that. I've thought about that a lot, like to think about if you were to try to write like great lives of the last 500 years or something. There gets to a point where like, would you include like, Ronald Reagan or something? Like it's almost too present. It starts to feel like, you know, I don't know. But yeah, so I think he was generally writing about the older stuff. He goes back as far as like Solon and Lycurgus and Athens and Sparta, which is like, I want to say 550 or 500 BC.
Okay. Um, okay. My other big question for you is why do you think like Charlotte Mason and her program in her, school curriculum program did not put this under history, but she put it under the heading of citizenship. And I think this is all they really did for citizenship. I may be wrong about that, but it was definitely important. And that's how she saw it.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could answer this better. Like, I haven't really read the whole philosophy, the whole
Yeah.
Charlotte Mason philosophy thing. Which I know it's like a thing,
Mhm.
but and I also know that like certain, and this is cool, I guess. I would be with these people, but certain elements of the homeschooling community are kind of like almost like citizen dropouts in some sense. Like they're feeling a little overwhelmed by America and its craziness, and so it's like a retreat. So it's almost a retreat in some
Like a
sense. But
Benedict option, Rod Dreher sort of.
yes, yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's interesting. I would say, firstly, like as far as civic virtue kind of stuff goes, like you do get a sense of like the old classical conception of this. So like whenever Plutarch describes something as being, virtuous or commendable or whatever, it's going to be things like, you know, loyalty and bravery and valor and those kinds of sort of classical virtues, and not, the like post 2012 virtues that we're all kind of like freaked out by. So I think that's part of it, just to give like a baseline norm for what the good looks like as far as like a person. The Cato the Elder one is like a great example of that, because Cato was this like kind of like if I remember right, he was like a lower middle class guy of no birth, kind of rural, but like he made his way up the sort of status thing because he was good and decent and reliable and all those kinds of things. But I don't know. I was also thinking like it might be that, I think Plutarch was Greek by birth, like he was like over in Boeotia in Greece, and by the time of, I mean, by his lifetime, which is which overlaps, for example, with Apostle Paul's lifetime, you have like questions of citizenship that would have been like pressing for Plutarch, as for, remember where Paul says like, I'm as Jewish as anybody else, but I'm a Roman citizen also.
Mhm.
Like that's sort of Plutarch's situation too. Born in Boeotia, I think, Greece, but then a Roman citizen. And so he spends most of his life in Greece, but then I think ends up in Rome a little bit. And of course, Rome by the first century was doing all kinds of interesting, you know, uh, maneuvering. Like there's barbarians trying to sack them, or become senators in some cases. And I mean, he'll write about that. Like if in the life of, like, I think it's Lycurgus, he I think Lycurgus like didn't allow uh like immigrants to come to Sparta or something like that, and he had this interesting reason, which was like, I think it was like, I'm not afraid that they'll like steal our cultural technologies, but that they would bring corruption in with them somehow, or something like that. So he'll just give you these like kind of historical anecdotes that are sort of interesting to think about the polity and like how civilians ought to relate. Maybe I wanted to read you something.
Okay.
And this is gonna like tie together everything we've been talking about. So this is in the Life of Pericles, kind of like why should we read Plutarch, but also about the citizenship thing and whatever. And so there's this scene, I don't know where it is in the Pericles life. And it says Pericles enthusiastically espoused the popular cause and chose the side of the mass of poor people rather than that of the rich few, despite the fact that this ran contrary to his own nature, which was very far from being sympathetic to the common people. Nevertheless, motivated by the fear of being suspected of tyrannical ambitions, apparently, and by the realization that Simon belonged to the aristocratic party and stood in exceptionally high favor with the upper classes, he won over the common people. Okay, blah, blah, blah. He only went to certain streets. And then this is what I love is that then Plutarch says the point is that conviviality tends to undermine authority, and it is hard to maintain an appearance of gravity in the midst of familiar social intercourse. And so this is the distinction between like I used to talk to students about this between like narration where you're telling what happened and commentary where like you're all of a sudden the narrator will go, well, here's why that's important, you know. And Plutarch is great. Like I'm always a sucker for this. One of the reasons I like Herman Melville so much and Hawthorne is that at the end of their like long paragraphs they'll give you that like one line zinger, and like he does the same thing, and it's amazing to me to be able to sort of give us those insights. And notice that it's not even like judgy. It's kind of he's like he's not even taking sides. He's not saying like Pericles, you know, descended too low and that undermined his authority. He doesn't say that. He's just saying it's difficult if you do decide to be convivial with the people, it will sort of rob you of some of your authority potentially. But you might still want to do it, but just know that. You know what I mean? So that's like a very sophisticated analysis of like social dynamics and whatever class and power and all those kinds of things. And I
Mhm.
don't know how a 10-year-old would like understand any of that, but you know, maybe again, like there's an accumulation of it along the way.
Do you think that Plutarch kind of like breaks the third wall like that in like almost like a modern
That's
way?
interesting. I mean, I love thinking about that. I do think I like I don't think that's a bad question at all. Like I think it's possible. I don't want to overstate it, but I think that by
Is
the
it the
time
third
of
wall or the
Plutarch, like
fourth wall? Sorry.
oh, I don't know, in the
I
book, I don't know.
misspeak.
I guess it would be the fourth one. Yeah.
Sorry about
But
that.
like in I know what you meant, but that like I think by the end of the first century, like yes, they're very self-aware about like what they're doing. That's part of the reason that he'll start a lot of the essays with kind of like a he kind of like it's interesting, it's almost cinematic. Sometimes he'll kind of come in from a weird angle and he'll be like, there was once a so and so from this town who made the quip that this, and then like you're that's how he arrives at why he's telling you first about like Caesar's father or something. You know, it's he's very good at that, very good at narration. I know that because like even I think it was Polybius, like which is maybe I got my dates, maybe 200 BC or 100 BC, something like that, was already writing about writing history. Like, so they're very self-aware. Like, they're doing the thing where they're like, well, we know how Thucydides and Herodotus did it, but now maybe there's like they're almost in a new era. It feels like, and of course that makes sense because Rome is so cosmopolitan by the end of the first century that like I don't know. They didn't have like the printing press, but they did have like scribe houses of people that would churn out books, and it was a thing, you know. So there would have been some self awareness like that.
Um, okay, so going back to what you said about like citizenship and Plutarch, or I mean, kind of like getting some of those like classical virtues. Do you think
Yeah,
that like, the mainstream establishment would see Plutarch as kind of like dangerous to be reading in 2023? Or do you think like, because it's not really widely taught anymore, but it used to
yeah,
be.
that's the thing. I mean, that's part of what's frustrating about it is that like as a Plutarch enjoyer, it's just it's frustrating that it does seem to be s- quite inaccessible to like the mass of humanity that goes by, you know, Americans now. I don't know how to account for that. Like, would it be dangerous if they all started reading Plutarch? Is an interesting question because they're just not gonna. Like, you can just tell. Like, there's too much distraction. There's sports and there's movies and stuff, and so it's easier to just take in like. I mean, the reason is because like what you see in like and I'll watch a movie. I'm not like a weirdo. I just watched a Amy Adams movie that was delightful, but like it's what you get in these contemporary movies is uh it's like right in harmony with the zeitgeist kind of.
Mhm.
So like it doesn't shake you at all. Whereas when you read Plutarch, there are like constant scenes where you're like that would never happen now. It's and so like the jarring nature, that sort of uh perpendicular nature of it is, I think, good for people. I mean, that's definitely. I don't want to again, like I don't want to overstate that because I think it could become like sometimes it's like travel. It's the same thing with travel. Like people will become like, you know, travel fanatics and it becomes an end in itself, which I don't necessarily recommend. But it's good to do it once or twice or a few times so that you see that like they really live differently in Mexico and Japan and elsewhere.
Mhm.
So it's the same with like revisiting the um I don't know, like the 4th century BC
Mhm.
Sparta, where they'll like there's like naked exercise and they have these weird marriage customs and stuff. I mean, it's yeah. So there's some of that for sure.
So that question that I asked you about, like, why can't we read like a summary of Plutarch?
Oh yeah.
Um, and then this whole idea
Oh
that if you are reading Plutarch to an 11-year-old, you're not really supposed to like explain it. Like, see, like, this was the thing that he did that was like virtuous. Like, you're supposed to just kind of let them, take what they will. Um,
yeah.
so why do you think it's better to do something? And you could apply this to other books too. Um, like, why do you think it is better, if you do think it's better, to like essentially, you know, read Plutarch to a child to, like present human nature or so they can like assess virtue rather than trying
Mhm,
to like teach them character formally, like through like a character
mhm.
curriculum? Like, because that is a thing too. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I wouldn't be against trying to teach it formally sometimes. I think that can be helpful. I think I remember some of the like almost my dad was like into kind of self-help literature and stuff, so he would sometimes give us kind of like quotables, like little maxims of moral wisdom, and some of them stuck with me. They were very like just direct, patience is a virtue or whatever.
Mhm.
And even if you don't really understand that when you're 8, if dad says it enough, like you you come to understand it, or at least sort of. But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, part of the reason is because reading a summary, what you get is a. I mean, at best, you're going to get like it's interesting to do this actually. Like I think there are summaries on Wikipedia of like the life of Alexander or something, and it just says like Alexander did X, Y, and Z, and then it might even say like and Plutarch comments upon some of this and offers insights into his life, but like what are they? And I think I wish I could. Yeah, I mean, like, look, you're not learning history when you're, or like that's not the chief thing. The history is like incidental.
Mhm.
It's like I'm struggling to not become a professor here. Like, there's this
No,
really great introduction. Can I just do it for a second?
yeah,
The
go ahead.
the in- the Okay, the preface to Hawthorne's House of Seven Gables is really interesting on this. He talks about how like he wants to write like a moral tale, and it's necessary to set it somewhere. Like you have to put these characters in a place and time specifically in order to just make the story happen. But he says that like it's not it almost doesn't matter. Like I'm not interested in the setting or the place or the culture of this little place. It's like
Yes.
I'm trying to just show a moral drama, and I set it in the year 1660 in Massachusetts because whatever, and it could easily be set in the clouds. He says something like that, and I
Hmm.
think that's true of Plutarch too. Like you will grow acquainted with the history, but as in fact, the other one I had opened while you were gone there with the baby says this is in the Nicias essay. He says, "My purpose was not to gather meaningless historical data, but to record data which promote the understanding of character and personality." And so, like, data which promote the understanding of character our data are not going to be like, neatly packaged. Like it's just again, it's not the cartoon superhero that he's giving us. He's going like, here are the relevant facts of this person's life, and they're always mixed. Like it's never more than 7/10 good, you know. So yeah, you do even like as a 45-year-old, you read Plutarch, or probably especially as a 45-year-old, you read Plutarch and you go like, I mean, this was just some guy, basically. Like it really was like, he's hardly more virtuous than me,
Hmm.
and like he was just in the place at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I don't know. I think that's really valuable. It's interesting though because it's like I wanted to ask you about this. It seems like it somewhat flies in the face of the like kind of lives of the saints way of doing history that happens like in Eusebius or somebody later, because there it's like you like or like what was the one that you asked me to read, the Chesterton biography of St. Francis,
Hmm.
where it's like, I mean, maybe I can't remember, maybe there were the beginning of it or something where Francis did something bad, he stole from a pear tree or something like Augustine, but like
Yeah.
basically he's a saint, and that's what you're given. And so sometimes, like, I guess the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think that a lot of at least a lot of the people that I like associate with on the internet are kind of convinced that we're living like in a period of exceptional immorality, degeneracy, badness. And so it's like they kind of want somebody to come in and clarify and go like, this is what the good is, do this. It's like it's like those matcha, like, eat 12 eggs a day and go to the gym and sleep 8 hours a night,
I've
and
been loving that lately, by the way.
yeah, I mean, and it's because people like need to be told, like there is a need for that. But I
Yeah.
think like when you're dealing with
Okay, baby's crying. I'm
like
so
for
sorry.
yeah,
This is
go. You can
this
go.
is like
Can I
the
keep
climax
talking
of the
just for a minute?
conversation, and he's crying. What?
I'm just gonna keep going. I'm gonna keep
Yeah,
talking.
keep going. Go ahead.
Okay. Like I was just gonna say that I think Plutarch is most important for people that you love, like that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, that are in your life and that you have to manage. And you know, not the people you're judging on CNN, like the like Zelensky or Putin or something. But you notice that like so much of public discourse is like Putin is bad, and Zelensky is good, or whatever. Biden is good and Trump is bad, and that would never happen in Plutarch. There just aren't those characters. So I think it's like if you're like, I don't know, I'm like I said, I'm in my 40s, and I've had enough experience with like family and good friends and changes of fate and stuff that 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 I forgot what I was saying there. The baby's so cute. That yeah, that like you need to be able to, like, in order to forgive people or to be like to sustain relationships, you have to be able to move past the idea of like this is the good guy and this is the bad guy, because everybody you care about, including like parents and siblings and spouses and children are going to be a mix. And like Plutarch teaches you how to kind of like stay with them even in the kind of like rocky periods, you know?
Mhm. Everyone's a
I was
mix, but
comparing while you're
also
gone.
not
Yeah.
everyone's equal, right? You
I
know,
don't think he's saying that at all. No, no,
well, yeah, some
not at
people
all.
are
Yeah.
more virtuous, and some
Yeah,
people
for
are
sure.
more, yeah.
But like, you don't get to really choose your family, for example. And so like part of it is you have to, I don't know, like be able to continue dealing with even the unvirtuous.
Mhm.
I was saying, like, when you watch CNN or something, or like look at Twitter, they just divide the world into like my team and the bad team, you know? And it's like that's not real. That's not very good insight psychologically. It might work politically. I'm not saying it doesn't work politically, but
I think
it's not, I don't think it's the best psychology.
you run into the same thing though with, like supposedly our guys or whatever, like they do the same thing where it's like,
Yeah, of course. That's what I'm saying. Like they want to go. This is our like. They'll retweet the people they know are on their team and stuff, and it becomes the, what do you call it? The echo zone, the echo bubble.
echo
And I
chamber.
think that's what Plutarch. Yeah, that's what Plutarch. That's part of what Plutarch calls you out of, because he's like a lot of, like, if he's talking about the way that who was it? Pericles associates with the plebs or something. Well, the very next essay will be some guy who, what's that? Who doesn't, and he's not really. He doesn't take sides. He just shows you these are just two different ways to navigate the world. You can either be like aristocratic, in which case you run the risk of offending uh, the commoner, or you can be like a populist, in which case like you might get run over by a bunch of elites who are conspiring against you or something. And so, like, choose carefully, basically.
Mhm.
Look at that little baby head. We can we can be done if you need to be.
No, I mean, now that I have him, he's fine. He'll sit here with me all night.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to leave him. I felt so bad.
Well, tell me like more about your, like, what do you think about, I mean, having, you've read a couple, at least Alexander's Life. What else? Anything
Yeah, I
else?
read Alexander. This was like a year ago, so I have
Did you
it.
think like, do you
What
think
else?
teenagers could get into it?
Yes, but I think like what you said about how it does I read a Agesilaus. That was like the first one. That was really
Yeah.
interesting. So what you said about like if you started reading it when you're 10 or 11 and your mom's reading it to you and you're reading like, two or three of these lives a year very slowly. And then like by the time you're, let's say 17, you've read, I don't know, do my math, like, 20, 24 lives,
Hmm.
something like that, 20 lives. I think you would, like, at some point you would start to get it, right? Or you
Hmm.
would at least like be so familiar with it that it would,
Yeah.
I can't imagine it like not making some sort of impression on you if you're reading it every year. And also Shakespeare too. Like, I mean, they're gonna be
Yeah.
reading Shakespeare. And I think it's so interesting too that like, like some of Shakespeare's plays were even basically like narrations of Plutarch, like Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
I think that's like, I think that's so cool because I feel like that combined with like, Plutarch's showing people that like these historical figures are real, like shows them like, oh, like also like Shakespeare was like just a guy. Like,
Right.
maybe I could do that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's also like, I think about the way that, like, this is a big commitment. Like, if you do decide to homeschool your kids for all, like, for up to age 18 or something,
Mhm.
and when you think about all that time invested, both from the mother and the child, it's like you have to be clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it, what you're preparing them for. And it's like it may help. It probably does help. Certainly, probably helps to give them big imaginations and maybe even big vocabularies so they can qualify for law school or something. But I think ultimately, like it really is more of like a humanist kind of thing. Like you're preparing them to be men and women of character, which like is definitely valuable. Like I'm for it. You should do it, but I'm not. The world doesn't always reward it, honestly.
I mean, yeah,
So
that's what Boethius was saying, right?
exactly. Like just know that. I guess that like like especially because I do think like I guess what I would predict would happen was that most kids dealing with this level, if the mother is really good at insisting upon it and they get all the way through age 18, the kids are probably at some point going to go like, I can't, I'm so happy to be done with reading that crap. There's going to be like a moment of rebellion. But I think it would be much more likely that a child schooled in that way would later in life be able to come back to it, like in a way where it feels like it's not a chore, but now they can like really appreciate it. And I think that even like again, in some ways, what's really interesting about it is that it's kind of like for so many people who didn't have the benefit of like a classical education, like John Stuart Mill or something. For almost everyone, like it requires like a leap of faith. You go like because you didn't have it. Most people didn't have this, and so you don't even really know what you're giving your kid. It's kind of like and maybe
You're
you can learn it
educating
with
yourself
them.
too.
Yeah, that's part of it. I think that is part of it. And that's fun.
Mhm.
I don't know, like I'm like currently reading I'm on like chapter 41 of Moby Dick with my 4-year-old, and he has no idea. Like he doesn't understand, any of it. But I'm enjoying
I
it,
understand
and I
more
know
than you
that
think he does.
maybe and there's like big words, and occasionally like now he wants to be a harpooner for Halloween, and like I'm okay with that. Like that might be a cool day. So like yeah, you just never know what um seeds get planted.
Yeah. My husband is reading Lord of the Rings to my 5-year-old, and he
Yeah.
loves it. He falls asleep a lot too, though, while he's reading it.
Yeah.
It kind of
Yeah,
like
I find myself having to explain stuff, but I don't know, like, I really like that idea that I hope that that was clear. I hope that people listening understood your question about, like, how you don't have to judge for the kid. You can kinda just present them with the matter, you know? And, like, Plutarch was a Platonist, and part of that is that I take Plato's dialogism seriously. Like, he really is presenting 2 sides of the argument. And so, like, when you get Socrates usually embarrassing somebody who thinks they know more than they know, it doesn't mean that that's not a serious discussion. It's not just Socrates dunking on idiots. There's real like ideas to be kind of crunched and discerned, and I think Plutarch like is thinking like that. That's like rare, right? We've talked about this before. Like that's the negative capability. It's like having big brain, I guess, instead of just being like a party man.
yeah. But I mean, isn't that, don't we need more people like that in the world?
Yeah, probably. But yeah, it doesn't seem like again, like I'm trying to think of maybe like a lawyer, it does seem to get rewarded for that because lawyers have to think like the opposing lawyer in order to be effective at it, you know.
Mhm. Yeah.
But yeah, but maybe you won't be like hired by some propaganda outlet to be an anchor. Like,
Um,
can you imagine? Like, imagine the news if like Plutarch was like Plutarch News Network would just be like, today this happened, and like, it was complicated. Like, it's not exactly clear yet the consequences. Like, just this very kind of nuanced, aloof.
But that's like our
I don't
ideal
know.
world, right?
Kind of, but like, yeah, it just I guess it doesn't sell or something like that. So they never seem to give it to us.
No, it doesn't sell, but polarization does.
Hmm.
Okay, I think he's had enough, probably.
Yeah, we can be done.
Is there anything
Thanks
else
for having me on.
yeah, is there anything else you wanted to discuss?
No, this was good. Yeah, we can maybe do it again.
any final words of wisdom?
No, I would not even dare to rival Plutarch. Just go read your Plutarch.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, and
Okay.
I'll talk to you later.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.